The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the sewing machine. Every machine is different, and so I can't give you a lot of information on sewing machines just because whatever you buy, you really need to go through your owner's manual, learn how to thread the machine, learn how to thread your bobbin, find out what all the pieces to your machine are, the tension knob for your upper thread, the tension knob or the tension for your bobbin thread. So usually on the machine itself, you're going to have a knob that you can change the thread that you've threaded the machine with. But with the bobbins, and every bobbin case is different. So this is just an example of one. Most of them are going to look different, and I have another machine that I can pull one out of, but this is for one of my machines. See that? I don't know if you can see it or not. It looks blurry to me, but there's a screw. There's a screw right there. So that, if I turn that screw, it's going to tighten or loosen, depending on which way I go, the tension on my bobbin thread. So you should be able to take the string of your bobbin and it not go zooming down to the floor. So mine's held right there, and that's what you want. But you don't want it so tight that it doesn't easily pull either. So that's how you fix the bobbin tension. Now let me get from my other machine. Oh, actually I can't get it out without taking the faceplate off. Well, I'll pause for a second and do that. Just a minute. Okay, so other supplies that you need. Seam ripper. Said that earlier, but I just want to mention that again because that really goes under other supplies. A cutting mat, a nice pair of fabric scissors. Now when you get a pair of fabric scissors, please do not cut paper with them. You will dull the blades and then you will struggle cutting fabric. They don't have to be expensive, they just need to be nice fabric scissors. That you save exclusively for cutting fabric. A rotary cutter, 45 millimeters is what I use. This is the cutter that I use that I absolutely love. This is a Martelli, M-A-R-T-E-L-L-I, rotary cutter, 45 millimeters. The way that you hold it is you put your fingers around there, and then your finger goes on top here, and then your thumb is on the side. And when you cut with this, if you hold it right, you don't have to put much pressure on the fabric. When you put pressure on a rotary cutter, it makes it bend slightly, your blade. Your blade will bend off to the side a little bit. That in turn cuts your cutting mat, dulls your blade, and makes cutting really difficult. So this one, with feather weight, you can cut fabric, even several layers of fabric. I've had about 4 other rotary cutters. This is the only one I'll ever use again. It has a spring inside it, because this, I can't do it on here. I have to have the cutting mat to open this, but you run it along the running mat and then it pops open so the blade's exposed. And then this, I can do it by hand like that, but that's not how you're supposed to do it. And then you close it so that you can't get cut on the blade. Well, there's a spring in there that makes that action happen. And once in a while that spring might break. Martelli has kits that you can buy that aren't expensive that has a replacement spring in it. Just a minute, my cat's going crazy. Okay, so the other thing that you need to have is some rulers. I recommend 2 sizes for starters. There'll be a couple of other rulers that you might want as you go along, depending on what type of quilt you're making. But for now, I would just get these 2. So the first one is a 24 by 36 inch. So it's kind of big. But this is what I use to cut against. Now, as far as rulers go, I've had a couple. And I, again, would not waste my money and buy anything other than this. Because I've spent money on other rulers, and they move on you, they slip on you. Even if you put the non-slip little discs on there, they still move on you. And so I found this brand, and it doesn't move. It's wonderful. I mean, if you don't hang on to it, it's going to move. But you put your hand on it to hold it down as you're cutting, and it's not going to move. It's called Quilter Select. See how it's not clear? It's clear, but it has this yellow tinge to it. That's the non-slip that they have on the back. The other size that you want, and this one is not one of those. Eventually I'll replace this and get one of those. But this is a 3 by 6. So I use this to measure over, which I'll show you this when we get to that stage of the videos. But this I use to measure over how far I want to cut, and then I put the larger one up against it like this, make sure everything's straight, and then I cut. But I will actually do a demonstration of cutting for you when we get to that point. This is just supplies that you need. Oh, and for the rotary cutter, you want to get extra blades. You want to have extra blades on hand, because pretty much after each project that you do, you want to put a new blade on, so you have a nice new sharp blade for your next project. And plus you need to clean out the cutter. Gets bits of fuzz and stuff up in it. It makes it hard to roll smoothly, and so you need to take it apart and clean it out every once in a while anyway. Alright, you need an ironing board, straight pins. Now, as far as pins go, I wouldn't get the ones that have the rounded head on it. You need to get flat head pins. And then the other thing that you could get, if you wanted to, are heat resistant ones, so that if you iron over them, they won't melt. These that I have, if you iron over them, they'll melt. But see how that's flat? That's just helpful in quilting, so that you don't have something sticking up that's going to get down in your machine, or it just, the flat ones just are easier to work with. Cotton thread, quilting safety pins. You need large safety pins that have a bit of an angle to them. See how that's slightly bent there at the bottom? That's so that extra fabric, extra thickness can fit in the safety pin without a problem. So those are quilting safety pins. So you need those, because when you put your quilt together, the back and the batting and then the top, you have to hold it together somehow. Straight pins aren't going to do it. They fall out too easily. So you want safety pins. So you need to have safety pins, quilting safety pins, to hold your quilt together while you do the quilting. This is optional. It's a binding tool. It's used to put the ends together, because when you bind a quilt, which is the very outside of the quilt that covers the open raw edges, you're going to go around your quilt and then you come to a point where you stop, and those two ends have to meet and come together and be sewn. So this, which I've not used yet, I need to try it so I can show you guys, but it says that it'll bring the ends together perfectly for you every time. You don't have to do it that way. I'll show you an alternative way, but it's not expensive, so I just got it to have it. Heat erase pens I use. So say you're making a half square triangle, that's a type of block. You have to draw on your fabric and sew on one of these lines that you're drawing. But then you have to get rid of the lines so they don't show on your quilt. You can buy washable markers, but I like to be able to get, once I've sewn what I need to do, I like the marks to go away so I don't accidentally sew on that one of those lines again that wasn't meant to be sewn on. So I use the heat erase pens so I can mark my block where I need to sew, and then I can do the sewing, and then I can run my iron over it and they're gone. The marks are gone. So I prefer those, but you can use other types of mark. You can use the marking pencils. I think those come out, are machine washable out, but I don't know, I just prefer the heat erase ones because mark it, if say I make a mistake, I can just put the iron over on it and my marks are gone and I can start over. If I'm using something that has to be washed out and I make a mistake, well, I'm stuck with that mistake and I still need my lines, and so I'm gonna have to remember which line wasn't the mistake. So I like the heat erase ones. Meandering template, that's optional just for quilting. I showed you that already. This is the meandering template. Needles and thread, we've already discussed that. You need your fabric, you need batting, and you need backing fabric. So for batting, I use Quilter's Dream. I like it the best. You can get Hobbs. There's a couple of brands that you can buy. You have to watch when you buy some of these, though. It'll say it has a scrim or it doesn't have a scrim. I don't like the ones with the scrim because that can only go one way, up or down. With the Quilter's Dream that I buy, it doesn't matter. There's not a right side up, right side down. It's the same on both sides. It's very nice batting. It holds up well. It washes well. They have 100% cotton batting, which is what I always use. But they also have wool batting. They've got bamboo batting, which at some point I want to try because if you live in a hot environment, that is supposed to be cooler than cotton. And I live in North Carolina, so it is kind of warm here. So at some point I want to try their bamboo, but I just haven't yet. I just really like their cotton batting, and so I usually just always use that. And I use the deluxe. They have different weights of batting. Oh, they also have a polyester cotton batting, but again, I don't use that because I make, like I said, I make bowl cozies and plate cozies that need to be able to go into the microwave. And if I put polyester in the microwave, it's going to burn. So that's the other reason I go with all cotton. I know what I have here is all cotton. I wouldn't accidentally put a polyester blend in my bowl cozy and then have it catch on fire in the microwave. So, and 100% cotton, when you put it in a quilt, it keeps you warm, but it doesn't, it's also breathable. Especially like when you're making baby quilts, you want them to be breathable and you want them to be 100% natural. So by using 100% cotton fabric, cotton backing, cotton batting, you have 100% natural baby quilt. So that's what I prefer for my baby quilts as well. The backing fabrics usually come in ranges from 42 to 43 inches wide. They do carry backing fabrics that are 108 inches wide, which means you have to buy less fabric when you're doing the back of a quilt. And so it can save you some money, but you're limited to what is available. They don't have, not everything that comes in 42 or 43 inch width is available in the 108. So you may not find anything you like in that size, and then you just use the regular 42 or 43 inch, which is what I normally use. I rarely will find one that's 108 inches that I really like. Before we move on, let me show you my cutting mat. So just one second, let me get over there. Okay, this is my cutting mat. It is 24 by 36 inches, which I recommend because I can take a piece of fabric that is your typical 42 inch width of fabric, and it fits on here so that I can then put my quilting ruler down, and then I have my smaller ruler. Say I want to cut this at 3 inches. I move my ruler close, butted up next to that, and then I move down here and measure 3 inches, and then I would take my rotary cutter and then cut. And having this size means that I don't have to cut a little bit and then move the fabric down and cut some more. I can cut the full length of the fabric because this is large enough for your normal size fabric to cut it. The other thing that I like that's not necessary, but I like it, is a non-slip pad that goes under the cutting mat. Now, I didn't have that for a long time. I just recently got it, but I really like it. The one I have is called True Cut, and they have a website. It's just a non-slip pad. I can't remember if I got that on their website or if I ordered it on Amazon. I'm not really sure. But anyway, it just keeps your cutting mat from sliding, which mine used to slide a lot. So I ended up getting that, and I'm really happy that I did. So anyway, that's my cutting mat. All right, moving on. Quilting words to know. You'll see some abbreviations that you need to know what they mean. So WOF, that means width of fabric, which again is typically 42 to 43 inches. Seam allowance, that is how far over from the edge you're going to sew. Typically it's 1/4 of an inch, which we talked about earlier, but sometimes it might call for a scant 1/4 of an inch. Subcut. So once a pattern will say cut 1 strip 3 inches times width of fabric. So you're going to go over 3 inches and cut the entire width of fabric. And then after that it's going to say subcut 3 by 3 inch square. So you're going to take that 3 inch cut that you just made, and you're going to cut it into however many 3 inch squares that it calls for. That's all that subcut means. It's the cut after your initial cut. When something says sandwich, that's your quilt put together. So the back, the batting, and the top. That's a quilt sandwich. Selvage, that's the edge of your fabric. All fabric has a selvage on it, and that's the edge of the fabric that you'll cut off. Say you cut that 3 inch strip of fabric, then the next thing you're going to do is cut that selvage off of that 3 inch strip, and then from there you're going to cut your 3 inch squares. And when we get to fabric cutting, I'll show you what the selvage looks like. Squaring or square, that means you need to square your block up. So when you sew, even though you might have cut perfectly straight on everything, when you sew things together, they can get a little lopsided sometimes because you can't cut everything perfect. And it depends on, you know, you could be a hair off from where you cut the first piece to where you cut the second piece based on the lines on your ruler. So after you make your blocks, you need to square them up before you start sewing the blocks together to make your quilt. Because if you don't square them up, then your seams aren't going to match. So it's always important to square them up, and we'll discuss that further later. Applique, that's adding another piece of fabric on top of a piece of fabric and sewing it onto that fabric. I don't use applique very often. Occasionally I did a quilt where I had these circles that I put on top of the fabric and I appliqued them on. But we can talk about applique more later. So let me just back up to the applique real quick. If you're going to do that, then you do need a machine that can do at least a zigzag stitch. Otherwise you have to go straight stitch all the way around the outside of the circle, like what I did. And that's what I did because I was using my straight stitch machine. But I've done it again, and I've used the applique setting on my other machine. So what that does, it puts the needle down into your fabric that you're appliquing on, and then it goes to the outside of the applique fabric into your bottom piece of fabric. And then it moves it forward and then goes back further into the applique fabric. But I'll show you that when we get to it. HST is the abbreviation for half square triangle, which is a block pattern, which is basically 2 triangles sewn together. And you can make half square triangles 1 at a time, 4 at a time, or 8 at a time. And we'll go over that as well later. Flying geese is another block pattern that's used a lot. So whenever you hear flying geese, people assume you know what that is. And I will show you an example of that when we get to that later. Foundation piecing, English paper piecing. On my YouTube channel, I do have a video on foundation piecing with freezer paper. So it's just a different way of making a block. Sometimes you have points, like really sharp points that you don't want to lose and you want them to look perfect. And using foundation piecing to do that, instead of just taking 2 pieces of fabric and sewing it together, can make a huge difference. It's the way I did one of my quilts, which I can show you guys later. But anyway, check out that video if you want to see what foundation piecing is. English paper piecing is a little bit different. With the foundation, you're not sewing through the paper because you have these paper guides that you're using. With English paper piecing, you actually sew through the paper and then you peel it off away from your stitches when you get done. I don't prefer that. I prefer the foundation piecing with freezer paper. Binding, we've talked about that already. That was the edge that covers the raw edges of your quilt. Fusibles, there's different kinds of fusibles, but they're used to stick to fabric to make fabric stiffer for whatever reason. Say you're making a bag, your fabric needs to hold up better against wear and tear, so you put a fusible piece of interfacing on the back of it. So they have fusible fleece, fusible interfacing, they have single-sided fusible interfacing, they have double-sided fusible interfacing. So it just depends on what you're working on, what type that you need. With applique, you would want double-sided fusible interfacing. so that you stick it to your applique piece to one side of the interfacing, and then you peel off the paper of the back side of it and you stick it to your fabric and iron it down. And so now that is stuck to the applique bit, is stuck to your fabric, so that it makes it easier to sew it. Sometimes you don't want it, you don't want to stick something down on both sides. You want it just on the back of your fabric, and then you would use single-sided. The applique, or the Fusible Fleece, is a little bit different than interfacing, because interfacing is thin. Fusible Fleece is a little bit thick, not much, but it just adds some padding to what you're doing. So like I make makeup bags, that allows some padding on the outside of the bag, and then I put a lining inside that's a plasticky type of lining that's called PUL. It's polyurethane laminate, I think is what it's called. But then you can easily wipe it out to clean it up or throw it in the wash machine. But that's, if you hear fusibles, that's what they're talking about, things like that. All right, so machine stitching. Whenever you're going to start stitching, you need to iron your fabric. So before you cut, you want to iron your fabric, because it's going to make a difference on those measurements if you have a crease in fabric. So you want to iron your fabric before you cut, and then if need be, if your fabric has gotten creased again, you want to iron it before you actually start sewing. When you are sewing, you want to pull your threads to the back of the foot. Sometimes when you start sewing, it wants to eat your fabric down into your plate, where the feed dogs are, the things that bring your fabric forward. If you hold on to the tails of the thread at the back of your machine, then that won't happen. And I'll show you that at some point. You don't want to pull your fabric. You want the machine to do the movement of the fabric. You're basically here to guide it, to keep it going on a straight line. When you need to turn, sorry about that, this is my cat. When you need to make a turn, say you got to turn the corner, you want to leave the needle down into your fabric, lift the foot up, and then turn your fabric, set the foot back down, and then continue sewing. That way it saves your place. So anytime you turn, leave your needle in your sewing. And again, that's something that I will show you at a later date. Remove pins as you go. Don't sew over pins. If you sew over pins, you're going to break needles. You can sew over pins as long as when you put a pin in, the fabric part that's covering the pin. So you have pin showing, fabric, and then pin showing again when you put a pin in. If you were to sew over the part of the fabric where the pin is, you won't break a needle. But if you sew over where the pin is sticking out, you will break your needle. So I just say don't sew over pins. A couple of recommended books. I have the Modern Quilt Bible by Elizabeth Betts, if you're more into modern quilts, but it has a lot of good explanations in there on how to do a range of things that we've talked about today. The other one that I recommend, which I don't have, I thought I did, but I don't, is called Quilting for Dummies. I have a lot of the dummy books, Crochet for Dummies, Knitting for Dummies. Those books always explain things so much better than any book that I've ever seen. So I typically will buy those. And again, I thought I had a quilting one, but I can't find it. So I'm sure I have it, I just can't find it. But let me show you what the Modern Quilt Bible looks like. So this is the Modern Quilt Bible that I have. I got it on Amazon. It's just a really good book. It has, you know, obviously more modern theme to it, but it goes through and talks about tools and equipment, you know, things that you need, technology, photographing, fabrics, designing, colors, because color is important when you're making a quilt. So it talks about colors a little bit, it talks about fabrics, it talks about composition when you're putting a quilt together, grids that you can use in drawing out a quilt, drawing exercises, samples you can try, talks about symmetry. It has a couple of patterns in here. It has, you know, different shapes that you can play around with and try modern versus traditional quilts. The basics of quilts, it has a section on sewing basics. So some people like to put their binding on and hand sew it. It has in here how to sew different stitches like this. I've never hand sewn a quilt. I probably never will, but some people prefer to do that. It talks about sewing machine basics. Talks about piecing a quilt together, patchwork, triangles, so like half square triangles, how to make them 2 at a time, 8 at a time, 4 at a time. It tells you how to do all of that. It talks about flying geese. So here, let me just show you. So this is a half square triangle. See that picture there? That's a half square triangle. And then flying geese, see that picture there? That's what flying geese are. Nothing like flying geese, but that's what that particular pattern is called. Talks about curved piecing, sewing on a curve, inset seams, on point, which is different than when you're putting a quilt together. A lot of time, most of the time, your blocks run together horizontally and vertically. On point, they go together different, which we'll talk about. Foundation piecing, improv piecing, applique. So it goes over a lot of things. Finishing quilting, binding. So it goes over a lot of things that we've talked about today, but it gives you in detail instructions. So even if you're not into modern quilting, it's still a good book to have because it goes over so many different things. I'm sure that there's a lot in there that you would find useful. Anyway, that is it for today. I hope that this was informative to you and you will look forward to my next video, which hopefully will be out soon. Have a great day and I will see you next time.